It's World War III, but this time there are no teams. In the ultimate showdown of humanity versus humanity, what would happen if every country on Earth declared war at once? How would it affect you, and which nation, if any, would actually come out on top? First, let's talk about how World War III would hit home. The entire world is connected into one giant marketplace. This makes more goods and services available to the common person than ever before. It allows for things to be manufactured where it's cheap, keeping prices low, and global trade agreements including no or low tariffs means that everyone wins as prices stay low. But with the world at war, all this ends overnight. And with the collapse of global trade comes a harsh reality, the collapse of millions of domestic jobs. But don't worry, you won't have time to work. If you're between the ages of 18 and 40, odds are you'll be drafted into the military. But here we would probably see a return to the way that wars were fought in the past, despite modern advances. Entire populations would be forced into military service, drafted en masse to fuel their nation's war machine. Modern cities would be stripped down to make way for farmland. Most nations today rely heavily on food imports to survive. In fact, according to the Global Food Security Index, not a single country is 100% food independent. The closest are Finland, Ireland, Norway, France, and the Netherlands, and even then, they rely on global supply chains. In this brave new world, in order to fend off immediate starvation, the populace is going to be creating farmland and shoveling a lot of manure. Another immediate change you'll notice is a shortage of medicine. Nations today rely heavily on importing medicines from each other. That's because medicinal research is a very specialized and expensive endeavor, and so companies tend to specialize in a few products. For instance, the US imports 95% of its ibuprofen and 40 to 45% of its penicillin from China. Life expectancy would immediately drop. And not just because of all the fighting either. Again, with the loss of global trade comes a loss of access to global markets, and no nation produces all of the medical equipment it needs to operate on its own. Depending on where you live, you could see the quality of medical care drop substantially, as equipment and even just the raw materials to produce it disappear overnight. In order to coordinate an all-out national defense effort, most governments would quickly become totalitarian, with a possible long-term or even permanent loss of civil liberties. Every government has measures to suspend certain civil liberties in case of a national emergency. This allows the government to use executive power without normal checks and balances and thus more effectively fend off catastrophe. But a global war event would require a long-term national response that could only be effectively managed by a totalitarian government. There is no room for political infighting when survival's at stake. In a desperate bid to defend themselves, nations would suspend all environmental protections to ensure access to resources for critical industry. Mass migration on a global scale would trigger an apocalyptic scenario as millions, possibly billions, flee war zones. Borders would collapse under the pressure. Refugee camps would swell beyond control. Desperate to maintain control, some armies might resort to outright slaughter to deter mass migration, brutally eliminating civilians before they even reach the border. Others might simply enslave migrants to put them to work in critical defense industries. It's not a pretty picture, but who might be posed to come out on top? Let's start in North America. Here, the obvious contender for domination is the United States. Unfortunately for Canada and Mexico, they just got locked into a cage match with the world heavyweight champion. But here's something you might not expect from the US military. Most of its cutting-edge capabilities would very quickly run out. The United States has truly a world-beating military. It's been said that the US doesn't lose wars, it simply loses interest in them. And this is true. In neither Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan did the US ever lose an engagement. It simply lost the interest in continuing to fight. People would do well to remember the US's stunning 100-hour victory in Desert Storm. In just 3 days, America and its allies effectively dismantled Iraq's ability to defend itself. The victory was so absolute that the war sent shockwaves through both Beijing and Moscow, with military planners in both countries admitting that the only thing that could stop a conventional American attack would be nuclear weapons. And yet, this strength relies on things that would very quickly simply run out. America imports most of its rare earth minerals, and these are needed for the microchips that go into smart weapons, with most of the microchips themselves also being imported. The F-35 is a world-beating multi-purpose aircraft, but it relies on several multinational partners to actually produce each aircraft, as they provide specialized components. The armor inside American Abrams tanks largely relies on British research, and America produces so few warships each year that Congress is considering for the first time in history to simply buy warships from overseas manufacturers. The point is, America's military is world-class because it relies on America's global allies and partners. Without them, U.S. military capabilities are going to be significantly degraded. What's likely is that the U.S. would opt to use its capabilities more sparingly, reserving them for major threats to carry out deterrence attacks against other nations. The U.S. is lucky in this global war scenario because it faces no significant military threats from either of its two neighbors. Mexico's military is competent, but ultimately entirely outgunned and outclassed. Canada's military, meanwhile, resembles a miniature version of the U.S.'s, with exquisite capabilities and highly trained troops, but in very, very few numbers. America has 1.3 million active-duty personnel versus Canada's 68,000. Throwing in reservists isn't going to help matters much, with the U.S. having 800,000 reservists versus Canada's 27,000. America's strategy would simply be to establish a defensive line along the southern border with Mexico and focus exclusively on defeating Canada's high-threat military. Canada's huge and mostly undeveloped terrain would work against it, splitting its forces between its western and eastern provinces. This would make it easy for the U.S. advances to split the country in two. Most of the fighting would take place in the more populated and economically important east. The fighting would devolve into brutal urban combat, as hundreds of thousands of Canadians joined in militias and resistance efforts inside the cities. The reason the U.S. would focus on Canada first is twofold. First, Canada's modern fleet of aircraft and navy, while small, has the capability to launch painful attacks against American infrastructure and industry. Secondly, pacifying Canada would actually be easier than Mexico, given that most of the Canadian population is concentrated around cities in the east. Canada's great wilderness would, however, give plenty of opportunity for resistance movements to grow and flourish. Canada's long tradition as outdoorsmen and hunters means that U.S. occupation forces would face an extremely determined and skilled guerrilla movement with plenty of country to hide in. But ultimately, controlling the cities and certain supplies of natural resources would be all that matters, and those natural resources would be critically important for rebuilding the economy and sustaining a defensive effort in North America. Pacifying efforts would likely take years, but require only a token force to remain inside of Canada. This would free up the United States to take on its southern neighbor. Now, people love to glamorize the cartels, imagining that they'd pose a serious threat in a head-to-head war against American or even Mexican military forces. But the reality is far less dramatic. Mexico's military already regularly defeats cartel fighters. Most cartel members aren't elite soldiers, they're thugs, whose only real qualification is a willingness to kill. Another reason Mexico's cartels wouldn't pose a threat to a U.S. invasion is because their only source of income, their international drug trade, would have simply disappeared overnight. Cartel revenue streams would vanish, and when those dry up, so does the money that keeps the cartel gunmen loyal. And this is exactly why cartels wouldn't just not resist an American invasion, they would welcome it. That's right, in our all-out war scenario, Mexico's cartels would almost certainly be fighting on the side of the Americans. And the reason is money. In a world divided by war, cartels can't make money. But the faster the U.S. conquers Canada and Mexico, the faster cartels can get back to carrying on with business as usual. After all, the cartel's primary market is and always has been the United States. Mexico's military would not fare well in a battle against America's own military. As a brief comparison, the U.S. has over 4,600 tanks, while Mexico has exactly 0. Mexico also has no significant air defenses of any kind, and few armored vehicles overall. It would be a repeat of America's second invasion of Iraq, only even worse. Mexico's military is even less well-equipped than Iraq's was in the early 2000s. But Mexico would likely take a page out of Iraq's playbook and opt to wage a guerrilla war instead. In fact, across the world, this is likely the strategy that most nations would take. But with American political and economic power sitting right next door, this is a strategy that's unlikely to ever actually succeed. Unlike with Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. isn't having to ship troops and equipment to the other side of the world. It's only going south of its own border. And the U.S. would be offering safety and economic stability to a conquered Mexico. It wouldn't take long for the U.S. to dominate the North American continent, bringing the territories and resources of Mexico and Canada into the fold. But in South America, an ultimate global showdown is taking place. Two military powers dominate South America, Brazil and Argentina. But between the two, Brazil is clearly the heavyweight. Brazil boasts a larger, more modern military, while Argentina continues to struggle with costly modernization efforts, and the gap would only widen in a global conflict. When international supply chains collapse, Brazil would be far better equipped to replace lost or damaged equipment thanks to its stronger, more advanced defense industry. Argentina, on the other hand, has a much smaller and less sophisticated defense sector, meaning once its imported equipment is lost, there is little chance of replacing it quickly. When it comes to war in South America, the entire proposition is pretty nightmarish. Despite Brazil being the continent's military superpower, it's going to face a titanic challenge to try to conquer its neighbors. Its best bet would be to attack south, where the terrain is clearer, and Brazil enjoys well-built infrastructure to quickly move troops and equipment. Its forces could easily move into Paraguay and Uruguay, coming into confrontation with Argentinian defenses along their shared border. Brazil itself wouldn't really need to concern itself with defense from any of its northern or western neighbors. Not only is infrastructure connecting it by ground to those nations rare, but any attack would have to pass through the thick Amazon jungles and the mountains. And this makes moving large amounts of military forces for either side a complete nightmare and not worth the effort. Brazil could safely leave nothing but token defense forces along strategically important parts of its western and northern territory, leaving it free to concentrate on the real challenge, Argentina. Argentina's air force is too small and too weak to take on Brazil's air forces, with its most capable fighter being a modernized version of the Lockheed A4AR Skyhawk. Meanwhile, Brazil enjoys a modest but very capable fleet of mixed aircraft, including Swedish Gripen fighters and American F-5s. It also co-developed some of its aircraft, giving it the ability to build replacements and expand its fleet through the course of a Third World War. Most importantly, though, the Brazilian military enjoys extensive use of data links to coordinate between its branches. Where Argentina would have the advantage is fighting defensively and using its special forces to take out key bridges and roadways that dot the countryside. The presence of so many rivers means that Brazilian forces on the offensive would be vulnerable to disruption by the destruction of key river crossings. This wouldn't stop an invasion, but it would slow it down, as the Brazilian Navy has very little capability to move large amounts of equipment amphibiously. The war to conquer the southern part of the continent would be taxing for Brazil's military. It would take far longer than the US's own efforts to pacify its own continent, both due to a difference in capabilities and the terrain. With the South pacified, Brazil would likely opt to spend time building a large amphibious capability rather than attempting to invade Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, or Venezuela through the jungles. But this long military buildup might also be the doom of Brazil as the global war continues to rage. Across the pond, Europe would quickly become one of the bloodiest battlefields on the planet. For millennia, Europe's favorite pastime has been waging war, often against itself, and often with brutal efficiency. The US-led global order after World War II put that bloodlust on pause, but World War III has unleashed ancient rivalries and hatreds. Europe is the most industrialized continent on the planet, with nearly every nation enjoying first world status. But as the war in Ukraine has shown us, Europe has irresponsibly beaten too many of its swords into plowshares in the wake of the post-Cold War peace dividend. Despite being an industrial powerhouse, Germany would likely see itself on the back foot. Both France and Italy have more capable militaries and active defense industries. In our real world, Germany is hard-pressed to meet its commitment to a NATO rapid response force without cannibalizing other military units of soldiers and equipment. By the time Germany could get itself squared away, it might already be facing French occupation. For its part, France is by far the continent's most capable military power. Boasting an all-domain military, France has long insisted on an alliance with but independence from America's military. The nation has historically strongly supported its NATO allies, but refused to lean on any particular American military strength too heavily. That's not to say it's completely independent. France is only able to prosecute its numerous counterterrorism operations in Africa just across the Mediterranean because of heavy American logistical support. But with Europe on its own, France is the continent's most dominant military power, with the most powerful nuclear arsenal. The real weakness of France, however, is its insistence on fielding very high-quality equipment in very low numbers, and a refusal to back down from this doctrine. Despite the lessons learned from modern war in Ukraine, Britain may once have ruled the waves and most of the world, but the days of the empire are finally in the rearview mirror. Britain's military today is so weak that it's considered a third-tier power by American military planners, capable of assisting with select, very high-quality assets, but overall a military that's incapable of even self-defense of the home islands. The British arms industry produces some of the world's best components, but almost exclusively for overseas buyers such as America. In the collapse of the international arms market, Britain alone is simply too poor to afford its own weapons and lacks the scale to make significant numbers of them. However, Britain enjoys the benefits of being an island nation, and thus it would be last to be conquered. Other contenders in Europe include Spain and Poland. Spain has a robust military, but it's historically been designed to fight alongside its American ally and supplement U.S. capabilities. While Spain could likely conquer Portugal, it would be best suited to then dig in and establish a defense of its coast and the Pyrenees Mountains, as the nation simply lacks the economy to grow its military exponentially. Poland, for its part, is currently on its way to being the dominant military power in Europe, being one of the few nations to take the Russian threat seriously. As many U.S. officials have put it, Poland is today America's most important European ally. Poland faces a twofold problem. First, it lacks natural defensive features, a vulnerability that has haunted it throughout its history. Second, Poland relies almost entirely on imported military hardware. Luckily for it, only two nations are suited for rapid offensives in Europe, and neither are going to be targeting Poland anytime soon. The Nordic countries have all largely followed the same model, extremely capable but small militaries. But with a combination of very defensible terrain, robust domestic defense production, and very well-trained and equipped militaries, invading them is going to be difficult. But their small economies and militaries both also means that none of those nations are going to be invading their neighbors. There is one European power that has been left out of the discussion until now: Russia. On its own, Russia is the most dominant military in Europe. It not only has the size and capabilities, but it has the resources needed to actually invade its neighbors and beyond. But while Russia would likely take the opportunity to seize the Baltics, most of its attention is going to be focused in Asia. It would find itself locked into a desperate struggle to repel a massive Chinese invasion, as China's resource-hungry economy pushes aggressively into Russia's vast mineral-rich territories. As World War III drags on, Europe is simply too industrialized and urban for any one power to dominate easily. The fate of the continent would take years, if not decades, to decide without outside intervention. In Africa, the best military by a significant margin is Egypt, which enjoys a large military with varying degrees of modernity. However, nations such as South Africa, Nigeria, and Ethiopia have very competent infantry forces accustomed to fighting against asymmetrical threats such as terror groups and insurgents. Given the vast size of the continent and the lack of significant defense industry, these countries would likely take significant pieces of territory from their neighbors while fending off attacks from each other. But the continent would have no dominant military power. The fate of Africa would be decided by an outside power. In the Middle East, time and again, history has proven that the most resilient military force is the Israeli Defense Forces. Not only is the IDF the most modern and capable force in the entire Middle East, they are backed up by an unknown number of nuclear weapons, which would absolutely come into play. Israel would launch offensives into its relatively weak neighbors in order to gain territory and thus breathing room. As it's been said, Israel is so narrow that the nation is only ever a single military defeat away from extinction. This maxim also explains Israel's aggressive military history. Turkey is technically a European power, but most of its efforts would be focused on the Middle East. Turkey boasts a very strong and capable military that is mostly modern, but in case of an all-out war, it actually has little to gain by striking into Europe itself. It would face significant logistical challenges due to the terrain. Rather, Turkey's best bet would be to head south into the Middle East and seize important energy resources. This would put it into direct conflict with Israel, who would be outnumbered but hold the advantage due to the modernity of its equipment and the use of nuclear weapons. As the Turkish Navy fights the Italian one for control over the gas in the Mediterranean Sea, its army would seek to strike into Syria, Iraq, and Iran in order to keep any fighting on their territories. This would also mean that any nuclear attack by either Israel or Iran would likely also be made on combat forces outside of Turkish territory. For its part, Iran would immediately begin the process of producing as many nuclear weapons as possible. This would possibly mean Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey launching an aggressive air campaign against it before focusing on each other. With its current political instability and collapsing economy, Iran would likely spiral into infighting almost immediately, rapidly reducing to an irrelevant regional power, ripe to be conquered piecemeal by its stronger neighbors. To the south, Saudi Arabia would quickly run out of modern equipment as it faces combat losses due to its over-reliance on American arms, which would no longer be available on the global market. War in the Middle East would be far from decisive, but Israel and Turkey would be set to dominate affairs in the region as they gave each other a wide berth for now. In Asia and the Pacific theater, there is only one power that dominates: China. The region hosts some of the world's best militaries, including the forces of Japan, South Korea, India, and Australia. But ultimately, China reigns as the region's industrial and military superpower, capable of outproducing all other nations in Asia combined. China's advantages are numerous, with its only real disadvantage being its reliance on overseas oil for most of its supply. Aside from that, China enjoys abundant minerals, including rare earth metals critical for modern weapons. It's well protected from invasion due to mountainous terrain that rings the nation and open ocean in the east. It also has a thriving defense industry that produces the only non-American fifth-generation fighter in active service in significant numbers. And then there's without a question the most modern and capable combat ship on the planet at the moment, the Type 55 destroyer. China's People's Liberation Army rocket force and Navy both would be more than sufficient to deter any attacks along its coast, and its Air Force would easily outfight even India for control over the skies along its border. With no way to seriously threaten the homeland, Chinese forces would be free to go on the offensive, and there is only one direction for an energy-hungry China to go: north. China's Achilles heel is its reliance on imported oil, and in case of a global war, it would need to very quickly seize new oil fields. Russia's Far East region is perfect for supplying the Chinese economy and military needs, immediately prompting an invasion by Chinese forces. Russian forces would struggle against a superior Chinese military thanks to the size of Russia and the vulnerability of supply routes into the Russian Far East. Chinese special forces and airstrikes could easily sever vital trade routes, isolating Russian forces. Meanwhile, Russian troops fighting in Ukraine would see a sudden advantage as international support for Kyiv collapses, but they would be too deeply engaged in Europe to shift eastward in any meaningful way. This is why, in the real world, despite Russia and China growing closer than ever, Russian nuclear forces still regularly train to fend off a Chinese invasion. The only option would be the nuclear one, which would prompt a retaliatory nuclear response from China. But the moment that Russian weapons were launched against China, the US would fire its own nuclear arsenal toward Russia and China. Once the nuclear threshold has been breached, there is no telling where the next attack will take place. America's own nuclear weapons could be targeted next. Thus, the US faces a use-it-or-lose-it scenario, where it's better strategically served by simply launching against both China and Russia, even if it wasn't itself that was attacked. The results are hard to predict. With Russia under both kinetic and cyber attack by Chinese forces, it's unknown if they would detect an incoming American attack before most of their own launch facilities were destroyed. It's likely that Russia would simply opt to also attack the US once it decided to attack China, and theoretically it has enough nukes to do so. We say theoretically because recent revelations about the Russian military cast into serious doubts about the readiness of its nuclear weapons. Assuming even half of Russia's weapons worked, China would be devastated by nuclear attacks, as would the US. However, both nations would be able to intercept a number of incoming attacks and are large enough to absorb even several hundred successful strikes. With most nukes being used in airburst configurations, it would also mean that targets would be rehabitable within months, if not weeks, as very little physical ground would be irradiated. Within a matter of years, we would see the United States re-emerge as the world's leading power. Not only does the US have neighbors it easily militarily dominates, but two giant oceans protect it from other aggressors. The US also enjoys the world's most robust defense industry sector, and with the lifting of regulations and annexing of Canada, it's completely resource independent. America has literally everything it needs for a modern economy in its own backyard, with a massive deposit of rare earth minerals being recently discovered in the American Southwest. As the rest of the world struggles against its neighbors, the United States would easily subdue its own and bring them into the fold as annexed territories. Within a matter of years, the American economy could be repaired to the point that Americans would soon enjoy the highest standard of living on the planet. Assuming that the world was locked into total war mode, the US could then take all the time it needed to slowly conquer the smaller nations fighting against each other. With the homeland safe and thousands of miles away from the front lines, the American economy would chug along untouched by war, bringing ongoing innovation and new technologies to the war effort that no opponent could hope to match. The only true competitors, Russia and China, would have suffered far too much from nuclear strikes against each other, followed by ongoing conventional war to keep pace. Once again, America's geography makes it clear that it was always destined to become a superpower. If every country went to war at once, who do you think would come out on top? Would any nation even survive? Let us know in the comments. Now go watch the United States versus the world, or click this other video instead.